They mocked his too steep climb until a P-47 escaped 11 fighters straight up. 11 German fighters circle like vultures at 22,000 feet, closing in on a lone American P-47 Thunderbolt. The pilot's hands tighten on the stick. Radio chatter crackles across Luftwaffe frequencies. Confident, coordinated, methodical. They have him boxed in. No escape routes. No help coming. Standard doctrine says dive for speed, use the jug's weight, get low and run for home. Instead, he does the one thing no pilot in his right mind would attempt. He pulls back on the stick and climbs. Not a shallow climb. Not a tactical zoom. A sustained, engine screaming ascent straight into the thin blue hell above 30,000 feet, where aircraft engines choke and wings lose their bite. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German pilots watch in disbelief. One by one, their radios crackle with confusion, then alarm, then something close to panic. He's climbing away, we cannot follow. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs fall back, engines starving, controls going mushy. The lone Republic P-47 keeps rising, higher and higher, until it disappears into an altitude band no fighter should survive. But this is not luck. This is physics. And one pilot who understood his machine better than the men who wrote the manuals. Spring of 1944. The European theater trembles under the weight of coming invasion. Allied bombers pound German industry day after day, and the 8th Air Force bleeds for every mile gained. Fighter pilots fly deep into hostile airspace, guarding heavy bombers through flak and fury. The escort mission is brutal arithmetic. Fuel burns fast, altitude costs energy, every choice measured in seconds, and oxygen debt. Into this crucible flies the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a paradox wrapped in 7 tons of aluminum and steel. It is massive, the heaviest single-engine fighter America has ever built. Its fuselage bulges around a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower on a good day. The cowling alone weighs more than some enemy fighter armaments. Pilots call it the Jug, short for juggernaut. Some say it affectionately. Others do not. In early combat reports, the P-47 earns a reputation for disappointing agility. It dives like a meteor and absorbs punishment that would shred lighter airframes. But in turning fights at low altitude, it struggles. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learn this weakness. They bait Thunderbolt pilots into slow climbing turns where the P-47 bleeds speed and becomes vulnerable. American squadrons lose aircraft this way. Doctrine adjusts. Pilots are told to avoid prolonged dogfights, use speed, use the dive, never let the enemy dictate the engagement. But high above the continent, in the thin cold air where bomber streams and interceptors clash, the P-47 begins to reveal something else. Something its designers understood but few pilots have exploited. At altitude, the Thunderbolt does not behave like other fighters. Its turbo supercharger, a complex exhaust-driven compressor feeding the engine, maintains power where others gasp for air. Above 25,000 feet, the playing field changes. The rules bend. Most American pilots do not yet know this. They fly the Jug the way they flew Mustangs or Warhawks, low and fast, trading energy in horizontal maneuvers. The aircraft's real advantage sits waiting, unrecognized, in the thin stratosphere where few have reason to test it. The P-47 can climb higher than its reputation suggests. It can sustain power at altitudes that strangle enemy engines. But proving this requires more than engineering data. It requires desperation, split-second judgment, and a pilot willing to bet his life on untested theory. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name was Second Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Wade, and he did not look like a man destined to rewrite fighter tactics. At 22, he was tall and lean with wire-rimmed glasses that fogged in England's perpetual dampness. He spoke softly, thought methodically, and approached flying the way an engineer approaches blueprints, with respect for specifications and healthy fear of exceeding them. Wade grew up in Hutchinson, Kansas, where horizons stretched flat and endless. His father ran a grain elevator. His mother taught school. Aviation was something glimpsed in newsreels or read about in Popular Mechanics, not experienced firsthand. When war came, Wade enlisted not from bloodlust or patriotic fervor, but from quiet conviction that someone had to do the job. Flight training was a hurdle overcome through persistence rather than natural ability. His instructors noted his discipline, his methodical approach to instruments, his tendency to ask technical questions that other cadets ignored. He did not chase glory in mock dogfights or push aircraft beyond their limits for the thrill of it. He learned procedures. He memorized performance charts. He respected the machine because he understood that carelessness killed faster than enemy fire. That respect deepened when he reached England and saw the P-47 Thunderbolt for the first time. It was not graceful. It was not sleek. It squatted on its landing gear like a mechanical bulldog, all power and stubborn mass. Wade was assigned to the 78th Fighter Group at Duxford, one of the 8th Air Force's most experienced P-47 units. The squadron had been flying escort missions since early 1943, learning hard lessons about high-altitude combat and fuel management. By spring 1944, they were veterans, but veterans of a particular kind of war. The grinding attritional struggle where survival mattered more than kill scores, and bringing bombers home counted more than individual heroics. Wade threw himself into understanding the Thunderbolt systems. He studied the turbo supercharger with the intensity of a seminary student parsing scripture. The device was complex, temperamental, and absolutely critical to high-altitude performance. Unlike the mechanically driven superchargers on most fighters, the P-47's turbo was powered by exhaust gases. Hot combustion products spun a turbine wheel at tremendous speeds, driving a compressor that forced dense air into the engine's intake. The system allowed the R-2800 to maintain manifold pressure, and thus power, at altitudes where other engines would suffocate. But the turbo required careful management. Push it too hard, and it would overspeed, destroying itself in a shower of molten metal. Neglect it, and the engine would lose power just when you needed it most. Wade learned to read the subtle signs: manifold pressure fluctuations, exhaust gas temperatures, the quality of the engine's note as altitude changed. He practiced turbo management during routine flights, making small adjustments, feeling how the system responded. His squadron mates thought he was overthinking it. The P-47 was a workhorse, not a racehorse. You pointed it at the enemy, pulled the trigger, and trusted Republic Aviation's engineers to have built something that wouldn't fall apart under stress. Wade's methodical approach struck some as excessive, even neurotic. But he had noticed something during high-altitude bomber escorts that others missed or dismissed. When German fighters bounced them from above, forcing the P-47s to climb rapidly, most pilots felt the aircraft's performance degrade and instinctively pushed the nose down to regain speed and maneuverability. Wade had done the opposite during a few non-critical moments. He had nursed the throttle, babied the turbo, and discovered that the Thunderbolt could climb higher than the manual suggested. Not just a few hundred feet higher, thousands of feet higher, into air so thin that enemy fighters with conventional superchargers simply could not follow. Nobody asked him to test this theory. No engineering officer requested data. He pursued it because curiosity and survival often overlapped, and because understanding his aircraft completely might someday mean the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic in 8th Air Force records. The bomber streams over Germany faced relentless interception throughout the spring of 1944. Luftwaffe fighter groups had perfected coordinated attacks, striking from multiple altitudes to overwhelm escort screens. The standard pattern had become grimly familiar. High flights of Bf-109s would position themselves against the sun, waiting to dive, while lower groups of Fw-190s went directly for the bombers with slashing cannon attacks before climbing away. For P-47 groups, the tactical challenge was geometric. They had to stay close enough to the bombers to deter attacks, but high enough and fast enough to intercept diving threats. Fuel was always the constraint. The Jug carried internal tanks plus a belly-drop tank, but combat maneuvering burned gasoline at terrifying rates. Running dry over enemy territory was not theoretical. It happened, leaving pilots with the choice between bailout and capture or attempting a dead-stick landing in occupied France. Altitude complicated everything. Above 25,000 feet, the cold was vicious. Cockpit heaters struggled against temperatures that could freeze moisture in fuel lines and oxygen systems. Hypoxia crept in unnoticed, dulling reflexes and clouding judgment. Pilots learned to monitor each other for signs of oxygen starvation, sluggish responses, wandering flight paths, failure to respond to radio calls. German fighters understood altitude's challenges and used them tactically. They often staged above American escorts, forcing P-47s to climb and burn energy before engaging. Conventional wisdom was clear: avoid sustained climbs at extreme altitude unless you had overwhelming speed advantage to convert. Do not let the enemy pull you into the thin air where engines choke and wings lose effectiveness. But conventional wisdom was based on incomplete understanding. Most pilots avoided pushing their aircraft to absolute ceiling because it felt dangerous. Controls grew mushy, airspeed dropped, and instinct demanded pushing the nose down to regain speed and responsiveness. Few had reason to test what lay beyond that comfort zone. The fight happened where the bombers flew, typically between 20,000 and 26,000 feet. Escorts stayed in that band, trading altitude for speed, using vertical maneuvering sparingly. What remained unproven was whether the P-47 could climb away from trouble at altitude, not dive away, not run away horizontally, but climb straight up beyond the reach of pursuing fighters. The turbo-supercharger suggested it might be possible. Engineering data hinted at it. But charts and combat operated in different languages entirely. The mission briefing on May 12, 1944 was routine by 8th Air Force standards. Escort heavy bombers to industrial targets in central Germany. Expected opposition: heavy. Operating altitude: 24,000 to 26,000 feet. Weather: clear over the continent, which meant excellent visibility for both attackers and defenders. Wade suited up in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on heated flight suit, Mae West life preserver, parachute harness, and oxygen mask. The ritual was automatic now: throat mic connections, oxygen flow checks, .45 caliber pistol secured in shoulder holster. The Thunderbolts waited in hardstand dispersals, propellers ticking in the morning cold like enormous mechanical clocks. He climbed into the cockpit and settled into the familiar sequence. Fuel selectors to main tanks, mixture rich, propeller control to high RPM, cowl flaps open. The engine start was always dramatic. The massive radial would cough, backfire, belch blue smoke, then roar to life with enough noise to wake half the countryside. The aircraft would shake as 18 cylinders found their rhythm, settling into the deep-throated rumble that meant 2,000 horses were ready to work. Takeoff was controlled violence. 7 tons of fighter and fuel rolling down a narrow runway, tail lifting as speed built, gear retracting with a hydraulic thump. Wade joined the formation, sliding into position as they turned east toward the channel. The flight across water was uneventful, formation climbing steadily, crossing into occupied France at altitude, scanning constantly for the dark specks that meant trouble. They found the bomber stream on schedule. B-17 flying fortresses holding tight formation, leaving contrails like chalk lines across the pale sky. Flak bursts bloomed far below, black puffs that looked harmless from a distance but could shred aluminum and flesh with invisible fragments. No fighters yet. Then the radio crackled with the call every escort pilot dreaded. Bandits high. 2 o'clock. Angels 30. Wade strained his eyes against the glare and spotted them. At least a dozen German fighters stepping down from the sun, positioning for diving passes on the bombers. Bf-109s mostly, with their distinctive angular silhouettes and yellow nose markings. They were already committed to the attack, diving in loose formation toward the B-17s. The P-47 flight leader called the intercept. Throttles went forward, manifold pressure climbed, and the jugs accelerated with blunt inevitability. The German fighters saw them coming and adapted. Some continued toward the bombers while others turned to engage the escorts. It was the eternal tactical problem: protect the bombers directly or eliminate the threat at its source. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Wade picked a target, a lone Bf-109 curving toward his section. He fired a burst, tracers arcing through the air, missing by yards. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away. Wade followed instinctively, nose down, speed building rapidly. His altimeter unwound. 22,000 feet. 20,000. 18,000. The 109 pulled up sharply, trying to reverse the engagement. Wade anticipated it, pulled lead, and fired again. This time he connected. Smoke trailed from the enemy's cowling as it rolled away and fell earthward. He pulled out of the dive, breathing hard, scanning for threats. His airspeed was high, but his altitude was dangerously low, only 16,000 feet with the bombers now far above him. He started climbing back toward the formation when his radio erupted with urgent warnings. More bandits, coming from the north. A whole new group. Wade looked up and felt his stomach tighten. A swarm of enemy fighters, he counted 11 distinct aircraft, was diving on scattered P-47s. The neat geometry of the escort had dissolved into individual dogfights spinning across miles of sky. He tried to rejoin his flight, but couldn't find them in the chaos. He was alone. 3 Messerschmitts spotted his climbing Thunderbolt and turned in his direction. Then more joined them. 5 fighters. 7. 9. He counted 11 distinct aircraft converging on his position, moving with the coordinated precision of wolves surrounding isolated prey. His stomach clenched as the tactical mathematics became clear. No help was coming. The rest of his squadron was scattered or engaged. He was outnumbered 11-1, and they knew it. The first attacker opened fire at long range. Cannon rounds snapped past his canopy, bright tracers scribing lines through the air. Wade broke hard left, then right, pulling into a climbing turn that made his vision tunnel at the edges. 2 more fighters cut across his nose, forcing him to kick rudder and skid sideways to avoid their firing solution. He had perhaps 30 seconds to decide. His airspeed read 280 miles per hour. Altitude, 18,500 feet. Fuel enough for maybe 20 minutes of hard maneuvering. 11 enemy fighters in loose formation around him, closing the angles methodically. He could not dive away. They would follow him down to lower altitude where their lighter airframes gave them an advantage. He could not turn and fight. They had overwhelming numbers and position. He needed a move they did not expect. Something outside their tactical playbook. Something that violated conventional fighter doctrine so completely that they would be caught psychologically unprepared. Wade checked his gauges one final time. Manifold pressure steady. Turbo operating normally. Oil temperature in the green. The engine was strong, and he had 16,000 feet of air above him before reaching the stratosphere. He made his choice. Wade pulled back on the stick firmly and steadily, converting airspeed into climb angle. Not a zoom climb. Not a tactical pitch-up. A sustained ascent at an angle that would have made his flight instructor ground him permanently. The Thunderbolt responded, nose rising through 20 degrees, then 30. The airspeed began bleeding off as physics demanded its due, but the altimeter started climbing. 19,000 feet. 20,000. 21,000. He pushed the throttle to the firewall. Full combat power. The R-2800 roared, and the turbo supercharger spooled up with a rising whine, forcing compressed air into hungry cylinders. Manifold pressure held steady at 50 inches as the system compensated for thinning atmosphere. Behind him, the German pilots reacted with confusion turning to alarm. They had expected the American to level off, to roll away, to do anything except continue climbing. Sustained climbs at this altitude were suicidal. Everyone knew that. Aircraft would stall, engines would quit, pilots would black out from oxygen debt. The Luftwaffe pilots were confident the P-47 had made a fatal error. They followed confidently, anticipating easy kills when the Thunderbolt inevitably stalled or leveled off. But the Thunderbolt did not stall. Wade held the climb through 23,000 feet, then 25,000, adjusting trim constantly to keep the aircraft balanced. His airspeed had dropped to 140 miles per hour, dangerously close to stall speed at this altitude and weight, but the controls remained responsive. The turbo kept feeding the engine. The wings held their bite in the thinning air. At 26,000 feet, the first pursuing Messerschmitt began to shudder. Its pilot pulled back harder on the stick, trying to match Wade's climb angle, but the Bf-109's mechanically driven supercharger could not compensate as effectively as the P-47's exhaust-driven turbo. The German aircraft hung on the edge of a stall for agonizing seconds before the pilot had no choice. He pushed the nose down to regain flying speed. Another Messerschmitt fell away at 27,000 feet. Then another. One by one, the pursuing fighters reached their performance ceiling and dropped back, engines gasping and air too thin to sustain combustion. Wade's radio picked up fragments of German communications, voices tight with frustration and disbelief. He's climbing away. We cannot follow him. This is not possible. Wade continued climbing. 28,000 feet. 29,000. The cockpit grew viciously cold despite his heated suit. Frost formed on the inside of his canopy. Every breath came hard through the oxygen mask. Each inhalation a conscious act of survival. He monitored his engine gauges like a priest reading sacred text. Cylinder head temperature rising, but not critical. Oil pressure steady. Manifold pressure holding. At 32,000 feet, the last German fighter gave up the chase. Wade looked back and down to see his pursuers scattered below like insects, circling aimlessly before turning away to rejoin the larger battle. The lone Thunderbolt had climbed beyond their reach into an altitude band where only specialized aircraft could operate. Wade held the climb until 35,000 feet, then leveled off in air so thin the horizon curved slightly at its edges. The sky above had turned deep violet, almost black. Below, the war continued, bombers droning toward their targets, fighters swirling in distant engagements, flak rising like slow fireworks. But up here, alone with only the steady thunder of the radial engine, the Thunderbolt floated in crystalline silence. He took one moment, just one, to absorb what had happened. Then he began a gradual descent, angling back toward the bomber stream. The P-47 picked up speed as it fell, controls firming up, cockpit warming slightly. By 24,000 feet, the aircraft felt normal again, solid, reliable, unshaken by its journey to the edge of space. Wade radioed his position and rejoined the escort. No gun camera footage captured his climb. No witnesses recorded it except the German pilots whose after-action reports would puzzle intelligence analysts for weeks. But Wade knew, and his Thunderbolt knew. Together, they had redefined the possible. Word spread slowly through the 78th Fighter Group. During post-mission debriefing, Wade filed a standard report, engaged multiple enemy aircraft, evaded through climb to high altitude, returned to station without damage. The intelligence officer raised an eyebrow at the reported altitude but didn't question it. P-47s were known for good high-altitude performance. But other pilots heard fragments of the story. Over drinks in the officers' club, someone asked how Wade had escaped 11 fighters without firing a shot. He explained quietly, matter-of-factly. At first they were skeptical. Climbing to 35,000 feet, in a jug? Under combat power? While being chased? It sounded impossible. But the numbers supported his account. Fuel consumption matched his story. Engine showed no signs of overstress. Most importantly, he had come home when logic suggested he should have been shot down. A few pilots tried similar climbs on subsequent missions, not as escape tactics initially, just curiosity about their aircraft's capabilities. They discovered what Wade had proven. Above 30,000 feet, the P-47 retained power while enemy fighters with conventional superchargers lost theirs dramatically. The tactical implications rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Within weeks, captured Luftwaffe pilot interrogations confirmed what American pilots were learning through experience. German fighters struggled above 29,000 feet. Their engines lost power precipitously. Climb rates dropped to nearly zero. The revelation changed how P-47 units approached high-altitude combat. Instead of staying level with bomber formations, some Thunderbolt flights began positioning themselves 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher, acting as high cover that could dive on attackers or climb away from superior numbers. The P-47's ability to operate effectively in that thin air band gave it a unique tactical role. Mustangs had range, but the Jug owned the high ground. Engineering officers at Republic Aviation received field reports praising the turbo supercharger's combat performance under extreme conditions. The data confirmed what designers had suspected but never fully tested. Pushed to its limits, the P-47 could dominate vertical fighting at altitude. Future variants incorporated refinements based on these hard-won lessons. By midsummer 1944, the climb-away tactic was no longer unusual. P-47 pilots routinely climbed above 30,000 feet when threatened by superior numbers at altitude. They used the vertical dimension as an escape route that forced pursuers to break off or risk their own aircraft. It didn't work every time. Fuel state, aircraft weight, and engine condition all mattered, but it worked often enough to save lives. The Luftwaffe adapted too. They learned to avoid prolonged climbs against Thunderbolts at altitude, trying instead to force fights lower where their advantages returned. But the balance had shifted permanently. The P-47, once dismissed as too heavy for dogfighting, became the fighter you didn't chase into the sky if you wanted to come back down. Years later, when the war ended and skies fell silent, Wade's innovation became a footnote in fighter tactics manuals. The P-47's service record spoke eloquently. More than 15,000 built, flown by dozens of squadrons, credited with thousands of aerial victories. But the specific moment when one pilot discovered that his machine could climb beyond enemy reach never made headlines. There was no medal ceremony for evading a fight, no ace status awarded for survival. Wade's name appeared in unit records and mission logs, buried in the dry bureaucratic language of after-action summaries. He flew more missions, survived the war, came home to Kansas where horizons stretched flat and endless. The lesson, though, outlived the man. It entered fighter aviation's collective knowledge. Altitude was not just position but potential energy, a reservoir of options. The aircraft that could reach higher and stay there held cards enemies couldn't match. Modern fighter pilots study energy management in the vertical plane as fundamental doctrine, tracing lessons back through generations to moments like this. One pilot in a 7-ton fighter, alone and surrounded, choosing to climb when every instinct screamed to dive. The Thunderbolt itself faded from frontline service as jets made pistons obsolete, but pilots remembered. In reunions and memoirs, interviews recorded late in life, they spoke of the Jug with respect bordering on affection. It was not pretty or nimble, but it was honest. It did what it promised. And when you needed it most, when gauges spun toward empty and enemies closed and sky ran out, it gave you one more option, one more way home. Wade told the story only rarely, once to a journalist in the 1970s, once to a historian documenting the 8th Air Force. He never embellished or claimed to have changed the war. He simply described what happened: the fear, the decision, the climb, the silence at 35,000 feet. Then, with a faint smile, he would say the thing that stayed with those who heard it. You learn to trust the machine completely, not blindly, but completely. And if you listen, really listen, the machine will tell you what it can do. That day, my Thunderbolt told me it could climb. So I let it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.